This overview will move from ancient Greco-Roman empires to biblical medieval Europe to mostly Italian Renaissance to mostly English Enlightenment to mostly German Romanticism to the analytic Continental Divide and to the mostly political late modernism. What really matters is each voice in the dialogue and considering who might have been left out, what problems they left us with today. I know I will offend people if I point out that this is a long list of leisurely white guys, but please note that what follows is mostly sourced from a few professors' lecture series with clarifications from Wikipedia, Google, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the past 2,500 years of philosophy in the next 45 minutes. And I'm sorry, I'll try to minimize the jargon. Of course, people had ideas they talked about with stories before people really kicked things into gear in ancient Greece, but the dialogue really starts with Greek phonies who started talking before Socrates came on the scene. They shifted the focus from who and why to what and how, which is a focus, well, at least the dialogue about a focus, it continues today. You have the Milesian physicists and the Pythagoreans. They were attempting to locate the primal origins of all things. Heraclitus and the Eleatics argue that the true nature of reality is endless change, called pluralism, or unchanging being, called monism, which again is a continuing dialogue. 4th century BC, that there are some sophistic analyses of conventional law based on premises about nature as a forerunner to the political science. For example, Athens has this whole long threat that they're giving to Melos in a passage from Thucydides in his book on the Peloponnesian War, which is considered the first work of social science. Of course, there's Plato, the most influential philosopher in the West. He's kind of invented metaphysics, or the so-called study of being. He aligns himself with Socrates, who drew people in a critical dialogue on issues such as what is virtue, and the Platonic theory of forms is the basis for Plato's picture of the ascent of the soul to a vision of the world above. He poses a question through his work, The Republic, what is the meaning of justice? Socrates asserts that for a just society or a republic to be attained, reforms or waves of social political change must occur. Plato's theories of justice, power, and leadership are expressed in his allegory of the cave, which is and the vision asserts that a just state cannot emerge until philosophers rule, and political power is wielded wisely. Connected with the metaphysical notion of a deep truth about being is the psychological notion of a deep truth about ourselves. In Phaedo, Plato argues that the soul is immortal because it's akin to the forms and will return to be with them if it is pure when it separates from the body at death. So Plato's sort of the source of this otherworldly spirituality that's very important in the Western tradition. Aristotle, the second most influential philosopher after Plato, was also his student. He modified Plato's notions of form to create a science of nature, or physics. His key idea was to explain the nature of change by reference to 4 types of causes: form, matter, goal, and motion. The most significant critique of Plato's Republic actually comes from Aristotle, who criticizes the 3 great forms or waves of change mentioned earlier. Aristotle argued that the desirability of the proposed reforms with the logic characteristic of his philosophy of moderation. Aristotle's ethics are an attempt to discover what is the good or ultimate goal of human life. His answer is that happiness is the life lived by a certain person, the virtuous person. Virtue is to the soul as good health is to the body. Among the human excellences Aristotle discusses are the 4 cardinal virtues: courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. 2 philosophical traditions emerge from the legacy of Plato and Aristotle, when there are a lot of change going on in society. Epicureanism, a little more elite. Stoicism, more adaptable to ordinary people, with the traditional Roman values. We encounter Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, and 4 later Roman Stoics. Among them was Marcus Aurelius. He's kind of popular nowadays. The Roman style of philosophizing is the combination of several schools of tradition into a new blend. The most successful synthesizer and the most influential Roman thinker was Cicero. people really hailed his work even up until today. Skepticism is a tradition like Epicureanism and Stoicism, came out of Greece in the 4th century BC and spread through the Hellenistic world, survived to influence post-Renaissance Western thought. We'll talk about that later. And, sort of with the empirical method today, we also have this sort of skeptical mental reflex. So, we don't doubt everything, but we're ready to doubt anything, as Hillary Clinton put it. But so, two major strands of Western tradition are from the Greek and Roman world of Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, but also the biblical world of Moses and Jesus. They blended in the writings of the Church Fathers, such as Augustine, the medieval period, Thomas Aquinas, and the mystics, such as Eckhart. They were heirs of this union of Athens and Jerusalem. So modernity represented a fundamentally new relation to both these sources of Western thought. So, for example, there's the book of Job. A good man suffers incomprehensibly and he pours out his heart to God. He's afraid to complain, wishing for death, yet longing to bring his case before God, and increasingly impatient with the friends who offer him so-called good advice that apparently misses the point. But if you expect God to answer or explain to Job, you'll be disappointed. But Job isn't disappointed. It's a very unusual relationship, but the people of Israel would have understood it because they lived through it. So the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament, can be read as a story of a relationship between main characters, God and Israel, just a group of people. The relationship is defined by a covenant that binds them, and it's kind of threatened because Israel doesn't really follow it, and God kind of punishes them, exile, destruction of the temple, but it's never broken, this relationship. So there's always expectation of restored peace. In the New Testament, Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, there are key sources of research on the historical Jesus, the man himself who lived, not the stories about him. Scholars disagree on this, but they all agree that the kingdom of God that he proclaimed is important to understanding him. Paul's early writings in the New Testament, he's called the Apostle to the Gentiles, because he was preaching about Christ to non-Jews. He formulated a doctrine of justification in terms of contrast between living under the law, as Jews did, and living under grace, as believers in Christ did, which affected Western culture from Augustine onwards, where it was the issue of the status of the individual soul before God. In 200 Common Era, Plotinus was the last great philosopher of antiquity, systematizer of the heritage of Plato, founder of Neoplatonism, and theorist of a form of otherworldly spirituality that was profoundly influential. He sketched the spiritual ascent of the souls, turning inward to discover unity, not only with the one soul and the divine mind, but with the one itself. Augustine was a church father, Christian thinker, helped formulate the basic doctrines of ancient Christianity. He formulated a Christian Platonist spirituality. It was immensely influential, but Augustine's doctrine of grace includes sort of this implication that God predestines who goes to heaven, who goes to hell, that sort of thing. Punishment, reward is already determined, it doesn't matter. But Aquinas adapted Aristotelian thought and philosophical method to the needs of Christian philosophy. He presents 6 aspects of Aristotelian legacy that Aquinas integrates into a system: logic, epistemology, teleology, motion, politics and legal thinking, an understanding of Thomas's social background and institutional context. The Dominican order and the discourse of the university helps grasp the significance. The problem of universals is the relationships of names to things, and of both names and things to standard categories, such as individual, species, genus, etc., which they're explored and they're temporarily resolved in Western thought, but we still talk about them today. That is, there's basically the realists, the nominalists, and the conceptualists, especially in math today. But a coherent tradition of mystical thought in Christian Middle Ages is described in terms taken from the Bible. Augustine and Eastern Christian Neoplatonists, especially known in the West as Denis, Augustine sought an intellectual vision of God, but the medieval tradition wanted to go beyond vision to ecstasy, or the darkness above the light, or passing into God. Meister Eckhart in the 14th century reintroduced the Plottinian theme of a deep inner unity between God and the soul that is higher than intellectual vision, as well as the ultimate reality in the depth of the soul. Using concepts taken from Paul and Augustine, Martin Luther taught that we are justified by faith alone. We can receive the grace of God only by believing the Gospels of Christ and not by doing good works. Luther started a debate among local scholars that blew up into a huge controversy involving the Pope. He concluded that the Pope wanted to take the Gospel away from Christians. The break between the Roman Catholic Church and those who saw things Luther's way was inevitable. John Calvin wrote a compendium of theology that made his reform variety of Protestantism more exportable than Lutheranism and spawned familiar forms of Protestantism such as Presbyterianism. A lot of isms, but he departed from both Luther and the Catholics by teaching that justification happens only once in life, which is part of his doctrine of that sort of controversial doctrine, predestination. From the close of the 15th to the end of the 17th centuries, Latin Christendom was transformed. The epoch opened by the Age of Renaissance, a birth of classical learning and art. The 17th century Age of Reason was characterized by a rejection of authorities and an awareness of tension between rational philosophic speculation, traditional religious belief. You see Isaac Newton. He brings the Age of Reason to a close and marks the onset of Enlightenment. So around 1500, as a work of political realism, Machiavelli's The Prince marked a sharp departure from the classical idealist tradition associated with Plato. Machiavelli's purpose in his writing was politically influenced. There were people at his time who wanted to write a certain way. So even though The Prince is the work he's well known for, if you look at his other works, you see this guy wasn't entirely crazy. There's also Thomas More's utopianism around 1500. He's a Christian humanist view of an ideal society. The features of the system are highlighted in similarities and divergences from Plato's Republic. There's no greed, corruption, or power struggles because there's no money or private property. The commitment of Christian humanist Erasmus to oppose excessive enthusiasm in any religious or intellectual matter was also around this time. Is generally rejected by most parties to the ferocious religious controversies of the next century and more. Erasmus has emerged again as a compelling voice of reasoned culture. In the late 1500s, Galileo Galilei promoted theory of heliocentric astronomy and quantitative rather than qualitative view of nature. He started measuring things, and he said that the sun is the center of our solar system. His demanding methodology in the sciences and his struggle against the Aristotelians, who controlled offices of censorship and philosophical conformity, became emblems of attempt to free natural philosophy, which is today called science, of course. Around 1600, Francis Bacon, politician and philosopher, undertook to criticize the Western intellectual inheritance and transform the human quest for knowledge. His work, The New Organon, argued that an inductive experimental science would yield a new knowledge that would be dynamic, cumulative, and useful. In the late 1500s, René Descartes sought to demonstrate that we could establish a criterion of truth and with it know with certainty the real nature and the real causes of things. His thinking challenged scholasticism at its core and altered the nature and problems of Western philosophy and science. Really, his far-reaching sort of effect is categorical dualism. So the world between mind and body, or mental and physical, subject and object. He also gave us the Cartesian plane for anybody who might recall that from high school algebra. Next, we have Thomas Hobbes, mid-1600s. He said people are not ruled by reason, but by passions. But not quite as nice of a take as David Hume, who we'll talk about later. Because he thought people wanted power and were afraid of death more than anything else. His remedy for this inclination to violence and aggression was a powerful state called the Leviathan, with a sovereign who would guarantee peace and protection of each subject. In the late 1600s, the man himself, the myth, the legend, Baruch Spinoza's principal work called The Ethics, expresses his metaphysical monism, which might today be more like pantheism, sort of a mathematical pantheism. He asserts that nature is not only the creation of a supernatural God, but nature is God. He also financially supported himself by grinding lenses and was outcast from the Jewish community he grew up in. So he is truly inspirational. Blaise Pascal was a member of the Jansenist movement, which argued for the need for salvation by faith alone, a state achievable only by God's grace. Pascal's Pensees became one of the publishing sensations of the 17th century, stressed the misery and absurdity of man and human life without God, the insufficiency of intellectual knowledge of God, and the role of his grace, heart, and faith. You might have heard of his wager that those who believe in a God doesn't exist don't lose a lot, those who don't believe in a God that exists do lose a lot. So Pierre Bayle was one of the most influential authors of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The arrogance of reason and the avoidance of the simple, peaceful faith Bayle believes leads to superstition, intolerance, and cruelty. The irony of Bayle's work is that he was increasingly read as irreligious because his fideism confronted a learned world that was ever more naturalistic and committed to reason. In the 1600s, shortly after receiving his bachelor's at Cambridge, Isaac Newton, in one stretch of 18 months, formulated the law of gravity, laid foundations of modern physics, and his law of motion, transformed the entire science of optics, and created calculus. Newton also believed that natural philosophy proved God from the order and contingency of the world. The Newtonian synthesis gave the culture great significance in inductive science. The generation of readers and authors from 1680 to 1750 was one of the most revolutionary in European history because of its fundamental change in attitudes towards knowledge and nature. This generation increasingly believed induction from data, not deduction from inherited premises, to be path of truth, and it made the systemic inquiry of experience into the heart of natural philosophy. So things start to get formal here. Among the European political theorists, John Locke has most influenced American ideas about government. Locke envisaged a social contract among reasonable men in the state of nature to legitimize a moderate government ruled not by authoritarian sovereign, unlike Hobbes, but a majority of propertied citizens. So still not exactly, on that utopian level, but John Locke's influence on the late 17th and early 18th centuries cannot be overestimated, because the culture sense of knowledge and the limits of knowledge were just so changed. His thinking dramatically impacted the culture with the ethical ideas from experience, the products of our environment, we are, and if changed, our environment would change who we are. So he kind of turns some ideas on their heads there. But Guillaume Battista Vico's philosophy of history had an immense influence on 19th and 20th century thought. Vico replaced the premise of Cartesian epistemology, that's Descartes, with his own principle of verum factum, which states that we know the truth about matters that we have cognitively constructed. Vico's work has an interesting implication for study of past, and yet he uses a more modern scientific method to demonstrate potential dangers of using those methods. So he kind of subverts the system a bit. Charles-Louis de Segadon, Baron de Montesquieu, his contribution to Enlightenment political thought was his effort to systematize an understanding through natural inquiry of the order and the instabilities of human political and social forms. His perspective and his moral agenda had a deep influence on American Revolution. He's largely considered the father of the essay, so you can thank him for your English class. Bernard Mandeville's career and thought exemplify central themes of Enlightenment. His most famous work, The Fable of the Bees, present his central paradox in moral theory, namely that private vices make public benefits. So, the individual is not opposed to the collective, which is not a popular opinion. But he's very rigorous, and he focuses on consequences revealed in the tensions between Judeo-Christian classical virtues versus modern commercial and secular society. In the early 1700s, Irish Bishop George Berkeley's most important philosophical work, A Treatise Concerning the Principle of Human Knowledge, established his reputation as an empiricist alongside Locke and Hume. His subjectivist idealism was cogently stated as esse est percipi. To exist is to be perceived. A little different from cogito ergo sum, right? I think therefore I am. So take that, Descartes, but now we're on to another legend, David Hume. His empiricism Marxist philosophy, mid-1700s. He's a Scottish intellectual. Along with Locke and Berkeley, he held that our mental representations arise from sense experience. He worked to reconcile necessity with liberty. So, can we be free? We're free to follow the rules. Just as Hume located the origins of causation and the constant junction of sense phenomena, he located the origin of our moral judgments in their constant conjunction with sentiment of approbation or disapprobation. Hume assesses the morality of behavior in terms of its consequences, especially in terms of its advancement of social utility. With Hume, we see a growing skepticism about the relationship of natural philosophy and religious belief, a skepticism that explains in part the increasing tendency of intellectuals to turn away from problems of theology to problems of secular society. Another Scottish philosopher and economist, Adam Smith, developed influential views in his Wealth of Nations about division of labor. We will also examine Smith's social philosophy, which suggests that a market-based society allows social cooperation to take place as an unintended consequence of individuals' pursuit of economic self-interests. So, here's another person saying that even though people are selfish, well, it can help us support each other. Next, we have the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He shared many ideas with Enlightenment thought, above all his Lockeanism, his deism, and his commitment to religious tolerance. However, for Rousseau, cultural progress invariably led to moral decadence, creating artificial needs and artificial inequalities. The problem then is to recognize the depredations of artificial social life and to seek to redeem those to the greatest extent possible. The legacy of Rousseauist themes is influential and profound, extending to counterculture movements of a return to nature. The first phase of 19th century European high culture is associated with Romanticism. This is my personal favorite period of philosophy. Romantics rejected the arid rationalism and scientism of the Enlightenment. A reaction against Romanticism, known as Positivism, had set in by the mid-century. The final phase of 19th century thought witnessed the rise of existential themes and issues. So Romanticism is the parent of existentialism, if you want to look at it that way. The late 1700s German philosopher Immanuel Kant, the man himself, developed steel trap systems on the limits of knowledge, reason, and science and metaphysics as expressed in his seminal work, The Critique of Pure Reason. Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy inverted the order of knowledge as Copernicus had inverted the position of the sun and the earth. Although I'm told that knowledge about ideas is different than knowledge about the physical world, but we'll leave that up to debate. Kant's derivation of his famous categorical imperative is act only by the maxim by which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Alternative formulations of the categorical imperative include Kant's principle of humanity, or act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means, but always as the same times as an end. Treat others as you want to be treated, except philosophical. Irish-born member of the Parliament, Edmund Burke, I shouldn't say philosophical, but reasoned, rigorous. But anyway, so Edmund Burke argued against the French Revolution, but he supported the American Revolution. We don't really know what he was doing. He was a weird guy in my opinion, but for the early 1800s, VIP German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, for him, history represents the necessary and rational unfolding of absolute spirit, becoming conscious of itself and discovering of its own nature. If that's not a mouthful, I don't know what is. But his historicism, the notion that artistic products and accepted truths of a given era are relative to the era, profoundly influenced Marx, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Derrida. In the late 1800s, the German economist Karl Marx, his historical materialism attempts to answer Hegel's idealist explanation of history in a purely naturalistic or scientific term. So he's not really talking a whole lot about the spirit, the spirit becoming conscious of itself anymore. But Marx's historical materialism posits two fundamental entities, actual historical persons and the forces of production. For Marx, real history begins only when technology has solved the problem of production. The hallmark of Marx's idea of alienation is his theory of work, especially of alienated labor in the capitalist system. Marx blames this economic system for the dissatisfaction that many people face in their work. He contends that such unhappiness is unnecessary and demands that it be changed so that we may experience fulfillment in our various forms of work. I should mention that he thought work was essential to life. So you got to figure out how to do it the right way, because otherwise you can't live the right way. But John Stuart Mill was a thoroughgoing empiricist in the footsteps of Hume. In moral philosophy, he has become the classic defender of one of the main theories of ethics, utilitarianism, the view that one morally ought to promote just the sum total of happiness over suffering, But he did disagree with Jeremy Bentham, his contemporary, who Mill said that pain and pleasure cannot be measured arithmetically. You cannot, add and subtract them. They only differ in quality, how you describe them, and people are not inherently self-interested. Bentham thought otherwise. Søren Kierkegaard is a mid-1800s Danish Christian philosopher who became the founding figure of existentialism by thinking in a new way about how faith is possible in Christendom in the era we now call Victorian. The leap of faith is his conception of how an individual would believe in God or how a person would act in love. His faith is not a decision based on evidence that, for example, certain beliefs about God are true or certain persons are worthy of love. It's a little more. It's a little more than that. Arthur Schopenhauer is most notorious for his philosophical pessimism, but he was one of the most ingenious and influential thinkers of the 19th century. The core of his theory is that reality is known to us as capital W will, though he was writing in German, so he didn't. But which is full of self-conflict, so that the world is not a harmonious place and human life has no hope of satisfaction. Only aesthetic experience and sainthood promise some escape from the torments of life suffering. He was also a misogynist, but now, born in 1844, Germany, Mr. Misunderstood Friedrich Nietzsche developed so-called perspectivism, the view that there is no metaphysical so-called thing in itself, and therefore no singular truth or truths about the world. Nevertheless, Nietzsche does present what would seem to be a singular thesis about the world, the will to power, or the Wille zur Macht, because he also wrote in German. All these guys are German. They're German idealists, but keep in mind these ideas are often misunderstood, and further reading should dissuade edgy teenagers. Nietzsche infamously attacks Judeo-Christian religion and morality and the project of self-creation with which he seeks to replace them. Again, we see an apparent contradiction or tension in Nietzsche's thought. He is, on one hand, very much a naturalist. He does not believe in free will, and he believes that each of us is determined by our biology, which, his conclusions might be dangerous in the hands of rejected art students, or so it would seem. The first half of the 20th century has been aptly described as an age of extremes. The Western industrialized nations underwent dramatic changes and traumatic crises. In this context of tumult and change, philosophers sought to reconceptualize the role and function of their discipline. The result was the development of three competing conceptions of philosophic practice: philosophy as regulative, philosophy as therapeutic, and philosophy as edification. Influenced by the work of early 1900s American logician Charles Sanders Peirce, his contemporary William James created a history of pragmatism, which held that the meaning of any idea can be found only in experience. He melded Nietzsche's ideas with the ideas of Ralph Waldo Emerson, kind of name dropping here. His project was philosophical so-called Protestant Reformation, with the individual rebelling against the authority of accepted truths and absolutes, like the figures of the Protestant Revolution rebelled against the church. His independent analysis of the world from a priori assumptions is impossible because the world is not fixed, but constantly remade by us. In the early 1900s, Austrian neurologist Zsigmund Freud's immensely influential theory rests squarely on his analysis of human nature. We seek to cope with inner turmoil through sublimation of our instincts, but our coping mechanisms are inadequate and unhappiness is much easier to attain than happiness. Freud's conclusions are unquestionably pessimistic and powerfully expressed in his work called Civilization and Its Discontents. According to Marx and Freud, we're suffering from a common malady termed the alienation of split self. They say we can confront the problem of alienation constructively by raising our consciousness. Freud in particular perceived society as the collective expression of individual aggression. The mid-1900s philosopher Sir Alfred Jules Freddie Ayer was one of the leading logical positivists. So this is when we start to see the lashback on all of those romantic ideas we've discovered. He argued that philosophy should abandon the study of metaphysics and take up detailed analysis of language, which eventually you're going to see people who say philosophy should stop at analyzing language. But he argues that we cannot empirically verify assertions that philosophy is the handmaid of science, and the job of philosophers would be to explain the meaning of scientific terms and logic. Max Weber, or Maximilian Karl Emil Weber, he's an early 1900s German sociologist. Some consider him founder of sociology. He studied the power of relations in society as part of his effort to demystify the world. His great insights were into the varieties of authority. The three he identified: charismatic, 1, traditional, 2, and rational legal, 3. He offered a diagnosis for the ways power is legitimized and administered in modern bureaucratic societies. Weber's also known for his thesis combining economic sociology, sociology of religion, emphasizing the importance of cultural influences embodied in religion as a driving force of capitalism, which contrasts with Marx, who said that religion comes from, they say the opposite things. So Edmund Gustav Albrecht, I don't know. I don't know. He was early 1900s German philosopher and mathematician. Husserlian phenomenology is a response to the positivism and historicism. Husserl was opposed to relativism, skepticism, historicism, positivism, all of the isms. Well, not all of the isms, but those isms, because they attempt to explain the mind in terms of nature rather than the nature by way of consciousness. In the mid-1900s, John Dewey's version of pragmatism represented the American values of democracy, progressivism, and optimism. Dewey was skeptical of truth, believing that what we call truth is simply what works best for us at the time. Man's moral ends are not eternal truths, but are formed through customs and habits that change over time. In mid-1900s Germany, Martin Heidegger's early philosophical being and time focused on our place in this world, what he called Dasein, or simply being there. From this seemingly simple start, Heidegger weaves a new way of thinking about knowledge of ourselves and our place in the world. He wages war on the tradition dating back to Descartes, refusing to use language of subjective and objective, but he was a Nazi, so bad optics. But Ludwig Joseph Johann Wittgenstein was a mid-1900s Austrian-British thinker who claimed that traditional metaphysics was flawed because it was based on mistakes in the use of language. We're still thinking about language here. The solution was to focus on the use of language that causes confusion, using philosophy as a therapy against, in his words, the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. He claimed that people play language games. One of the most interesting ideas is that of the beetle in the box. If everyone has a box with something in it that they call a beetle, but no one can look in anyone else's box, then nobody knows if their beetles are the same, just like many of our experiences. So members of the Frankfurt School developed provocative and original perspectives on contemporary society and culture, including analyses of fascism and the high-tech consumer society that exists now. They drew on Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and Weber. The Frankfurt School synthesized philosophy and social theory and developed critical theory of contemporary society, a strain that is still going strong today. The modern school of structuralism is an interdisciplinary approach to all branches of human knowledge that rejects all ontological and epistemological sources of meaning. So what we can know and the things that we do know about, reverse that, right? This approach posits that all humanistic pursuits are the products of deep structures that predate human consciousness. Early 1900s Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, I don't know. But he argued that language must be considered as a social phenomena, a structured system that can be viewed synchronically as it exists in a particular time, or diachronically as it changes in the course of time. The late 1900s French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss argued that the elements of myths gain their meaning from the way they are combining, not from their intrinsic value. So myths represent the mind that creates them, not some external reality which resists history. But philosophy, in the latter half of the 20th century, was written in the context of accelerating and often disturbing changes in Western society, politics, and culture. Philosophers focused on two critical features of modernity inherited from the Enlightenment. One issue was modern political theory and practice, the other idea of objective scientific rationality and progress. So as we get later into the late 20th century, I'm probably just going to skip the political philosophers, but anyway, so in the late 1900s, Austrian-British economist Friedrich August von Hayek is known for his defense of classical liberalism, or you might hear his name associated with neoliberalism today, but this is a set of ideas including free market and laissez-faire economics, civil liberties under the rule of law with an emphasis on the limited government and freedom of speech, built on thinkers such as John Locke in response to urbanization and the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America. Hayek is also well known for his critique of the ideal of social justice. All of his ideas sound kind of familiar, right? The Austro-British mid-1900s philosopher Sir Karl Raymond Popper argued that there are no subjective matters, but only problems in our desires to solve them. He said that scientific theories cannot be verified by only tentatively refuted, and that the best philosophy is about profound problems, not word meanings. You see, now we're lashing back on the focus on language. He also wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies while he was in exile. This book is an attack on the philosophies of Plato, Hegel, and Marx, which prophesizes the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and exposes the fatal flaws of social engineered political systems. So, 1960s American historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn. His book Structure of Scientific Revolutions argues that science do not progress uniformly by scientific method, but there are different phases of development. One, scientists work within a paradigm, which is a set of accepted beliefs. When the foundations of paradigm weak, new theories and scientific methods begin to replace it, the next phase of scientific discovery takes place. Kuhn believes that scientific progress from one paradigm to another has no logical reasoning. Next, Willard von Orman Quine's philosophy came at a time when logical positivism suffered setbacks in its attempts to reduce math to logic. He attacked positivism's attempt to create a foundational first philosophy that would establish the meaning of language, and he argued that first-order logic is the only kind worthy of the name, and developed his own system of math and set theory known as New Foundations, which simplifies Russell's some of the work in Russell's 3-volume work, Principia Mathematica. The history of mathematics, that's a whole nother story. Born in 1929, Germany, the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, his first major book on the origins, genesis, and decline of the public sphere showed how democracy was made possible with newspapers, journals, and public spaces where ideas that are critical of the existing order can be discussed and debated. Maybe like Twitter, maybe not like Twitter, but Habermas's theory of communicative action rests on the idea that social order depends on the capacity of actors to recognize the intersubjective validity of different claims on which social cooperation depends. So we have to give each other a chance if we want to have conversations, okay? But John Rawls, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, draws on the theories of Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau to argue that the best society would be founded on principles chosen by rational citizens who would choose the system granting the most extensive liberties to his citizens while ensuring the maximum justice. So, he has this experiment where nobody knows what role they'll play in society. These people design the society because in such a way that if they get the worst position, they'll be set up in the best way, right? Might be a little ideal, and but it is used to defend the modern welfare state, and there are a lot of critics of Rawls. In fact, there are some later in this presentation that I'm just going to skip, because even Rawls' ideas aren't really philosophy, it's more politics. But born in 1930, French-Algerian Jacques Derrida first presented his ideas to America in a lecture. He's starting from a Heideggerian point of view. He argues that metaphysics affects the whole of philosophy from Plato onwards. He creates a dualistic opposition and installs a hierarchy that uniformly privileges one term of each dichotomy, presence before absence, speech before writing, and so on. He creates undefined words for his deconstruction, such as difference, harsh writing, and trace, to describe the faulty structure of the language and metaphysics. I don't think anyone really understands him ever. Anyone who says they understand him is trying to sell you something, right? Okay. So, Rorty's also kind of political, but anyway, born in 1931 in America, Rorty argues that philosophers have traditionally sought to escape from history by searching for truth. He believes that truth can never be found embedded in language, but is merely a statement that we approve of. Philosophy should not try to be a mirror of nature. His pragmatism is a defense of postmodern bourgeois liberalism of the West. A little political, but he argues that by holding reality as an intrinsic nature and by advancing the correspondence theory of truth, Enlightenment philosophers turned away from full-blown naturalism, ironically in service to a scientific objectivity that required a radical separation of the observer from the observed. He tries to fix the shortcoming by following through on Kant's distinction between causality and justification. So now we get into sort of this guy, he gave a big idea, Marxist critique of Marxism, so that's pretty cool. But then we have this guy, he kind of says that moral reasoning is consistent, because it's ill-understood fragments of previous and more coherent traditions of moral reasoning. So he's postmodernist, but also conservative. Then there's Nozick. He defends libertarianism. His central idea is individual sovereignty, right? So we hold property over our person, and so we possess bodily integrity as a natural right. You might have noticed that this lecture series ended with three thinkers with similarly strong political biases. Parallel to philosophy's development after Freud and Marx is the development of critical theory. Right, with the Frankfurt School, people continued working after the Frankfurt School. Also called Cultural Studies. I have another video series on Rick Roderick's The Self Under Siege. It touches on a strain of this tradition, how it's relevant today. So yeah, there's also the Wikipedia page on the list of critical theorists. Thank you.